Now, Ian, you guys just did a report that you put together with Axiom Global Risks. You interviewed a lot of individuals, a lot of companies. What did you find is what they see are some of the top risks right now?
Well, the good news is that for the first time in a couple of years, the pandemic is not on top of the list, and it's because people do recognize that we have the tools to respond, even if it's taking longer and there are stops and starts. But on climate and on cyber in particular, at the top of the list, getting much worse than previous years, and understanding that there isn't global leadership, there isn't global coordination, and as a consequence, the challenges are growing.
In terms of how that challenge is going to grow, ultimately, are we settling down into what some call a new Cold War? China, obviously, a big part of American foreign policy focus right now. Russia, when it comes to the cyber story, front and center. Are we basically getting back into that kind of a mentality where we are segmenting the world? The global story is gone.
No, the global story is gone, but we're not heading into a new Cold War. And there are two reasons for that. The first is that if you look at the global economy, most of the key participants in the American economy are either maintaining steady state interdependence with China, or they're increasing their exposure into the PRC. A few are decoupling, and those few do indeed matter. But the politics coming from Washington and Beijing don't reflect the underlying economic realities, and that's really important. The other reason we're not heading into a new Cold War is because in both the United States and China, there is increasingly inward focus. The bigger priority in the United States is $3 trillion on infrastructure. The bigger priorities in China are things like Evergrande and trying to get their technology sector under control, their private sector from the government. And that creates an enormous lack of global coordination, but not because we're fighting the Chinese, rather because neither country really cares about global leadership. Very different kind of scenario.
But then at the same time, Ian, it feels like everyone wants to collaborate or work together on climate change. And even when it comes to, say, France and US are a really good example. They're going ahead about, the submarine issue. France is still really upset about that, but then we're all supposed to go to COP26 and be happy. So, how do we work together on these things and then not have global leadership on anything else?
There is a lot more grassroots movement towards renewable energy, and that has translated into corporates, financial institutions, and the EU doing a lot. The United States, of course, did nothing for 4 years. Now we have a president that's focusing a lot more, but an announcement that we're going to be net zero by 2050 is very different from something that's actually passed through Congress that shows how we will do it. We don't have that. China, the largest emitter of carbon in the world, 2060 net zero plan. No idea how they're going to get there. They just last week announced they'd stop doing coal financing outside of China, but they're not doing any coal financing outside of China. Having said that, in the last year, there's been more new coal investment inside China than the rest of the world combined. So this COP summit coming up, you're going to have virtually no coordination between the US and China, and very little trust between the wealthy countries of the world and the developing countries of the world, who are being asked to do a lot more, but they're not being financed for it.
But let's come back to the issue that Alix raised, Ian, and that is that China is into linkage. It wants to link different issues together. It can't segment them into different buckets. Its foreign policy kind of links what is happening on climate with submarines and geopolitics. How do we make progress in each of these different silos and avenues if the Chinese are linking them together? Because they're all going to move at different speed and they've all got different issues.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that there isn't a Cold War doesn't mean there's trust, doesn't mean that there's any sort of cooperation or even managed competition. The competition that's occurring between our two countries right now is unmanaged. And you're right. The Chinese government is basically saying that unless we're sitting down and talking with them on how to work through our challenges on artificial intelligence, on semiconductors, on trade and IP, and cooperate with them, they're not prepared to cooperate with us on things that we want, like climate. And I don't see that happening in the near future. I don't see a breakthrough, precisely because inside the United States, Biden said we're not in a Cold War at his UN General Assembly speech, but we all know that one of the foreign policy issues that the entire American political spectrum agrees on is we want to take a harder line politically on China. We want to boycott the Olympics, at least diplomatically, coming up in Beijing next year. They're ripping off our IP. They're engaged in malware attacks against the United States. They're building up their military capabilities. Look at Hong Kong, Taiwan, the 9-dash line. I mean, it's a long list. And I don't see a breakthrough between the Americans and Chinese anytime soon.
How do you categorize the relationship between the U.S. and Europe right now? And what risk might that pose, or not, in 2022?
I think that the Europeans, I mean, clearly Brexit was a big problem for the transatlantic relationship. It is the country that the Americans are not only closest to, but also most strategically aligned, because we both think about national security and intelligence and surveillance and the Five Eyes Agreement, more engagement in the Indo-Pacific, all of that. Now that the Brits are out, all the Europeans have their focus really on national security. It's the French. But the French are the third largest military exporters in the world after the US and Russia. And they compete with the United States. They talk about strategic autonomy. They aren't as aligned. And the rest of Europe doesn't see the world through a national security lens at all. They focus more on economics and commercial interests. So it means that the baseline of the US-European relationship is not only less coordinated, but it's less important. The Americans are pivoting into Asia. They're focusing more on the Quad, where Biden just had that first in-person meeting in the White House a week ago. They're focusing more on the new defense pact with the Australian and the UK, while the Europeans not only no longer will have Merkel, who has been the strongest leader from Europe and also aligned on multilateralism for the last 16 years, but they aren't as coordinated or as trusting of the Americans. And that is almost as true with the Biden administration as it was with Trump, which is really quite something.
So where does that leave Europe? What does Europe do next? As you say, we've got a French election coming up as well, so who ultimately knows who will be in the Elysee this time next year? Where does that leave Europe? What are Europe's options if it wants to be more relevant in this world that sees the US pivoting towards Asia, towards China?
Where does it leave Europe? It's a centrist but weaker German chancellor. It is Macron probably winning, but with almost 45% of the French populace supporting people like Zemmour and Le Pen and Mélenchon, who are, I mean, strongly anti-establishment, burn it all down types. I mean, Mario Draghi is fantastic, but it's Italy. New prime ministers happen every few months there, right? So what it means is weaker individual government leadership by countries in Europe, but Brussels and Europe in terms of regulatory leadership, not on national security, but on climate, on trade, on tax, on data, on privacy, actually mattering more. So look, in a world where the United States and China are turning more inward and having their own domestic challenges, frankly, there is more space for the Europeans, but not in terms of the kind of global policeman role that the Americans used to play, because that's just not where European power is. And it's not an interest that any of the Europeans other than the French actually have.
Hey, and quickly before I let you go, one could argue that President Biden has already made some significant policy mistakes. What's the biggest risk that the U.S./Biden administration does now?
The biggest risk, I suppose, is that they fail at the $3 trillion in domestic spend that they're trying to get, because that would be by far the single biggest thing he needs to accomplish as president. Again, domestic, not international. Having said that, it is an enormous priority. Part of the reason they screwed up on the AUKUS deal and on the Afghanistan execution of withdrawal is because it just isn't a high priority if the allies in Europe or the Middle East are upset with Biden. Biden's overwhelming priority, and everyone is rowing in the same direction on this, is ensure that the progressives, as well as Manchin and Sinema in Senate, get together to get these trillions of dollars done. It's not quite a new deal, but it's by far the biggest piece of legislation you'll see in the United States in decades. And if that happens under Biden, it matters.